I never believed in haunted houses. Growing up in a small town, you hear all the usual ghost stories, old mansions with tragic pasts, forgotten spirits that refuse to leave. I always thought they were just that, stories. That is, until the night my friends and I decided to spend the weekend at Blackwood Manor. Blackwood Manor was the most infamous house in our area, just outside of Boston, Massachusetts. It had stood abandoned for decades, its history shrouded in mystery. Some said the original owners, the Blackwood family, had disappeared under strange circumstances, while others claimed to have seen lights flickering in the windows late at night, despite no electricity running through the place. We didn't believe any of it. We were skeptics, a group of 5 college friends looking for a thrill. That Friday night, we packed our bags, grabbed some food, and drove out to Blackwood Manor. The road was long and winding, bordered by thick forests on either side, and as we got closer, an eerie fog began to roll in, making the atmosphere feel heavy. When the house finally came into view, even the most fearless among us grew quiet. The manor was massive, its windows dark, and its once beautiful architecture now crumbling under years of neglect. The iron gate creaked as we pushed it open, and I remember feeling the weight of the silence as we approached the front door. It was as if the house itself was waiting for us. As soon as we stepped inside, the air felt colder, damp almost, like the house had absorbed all the darkness and decay from the years it had been abandoned. The wooden floors creaked beneath our feet, and every breath seemed to echo off the walls. Dust covered every surface, and cobwebs hung from the ceiling like ghostly drapes. We split up to explore, flashlights in hand. The plan was simple: capture some footage, stay the night, and leave with a great story to tell. But it didn't take long for things to go wrong. I was in the kitchen with Jenny and Mark when we heard the first noise, a faint whisper, like someone calling out from the distance. We froze, straining to listen, but the sound disappeared as quickly as it had come. "You guys hear that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Jenny nodded, her face pale, but Mark shrugged it off. "Old pipes, probably," he said, though his expression told a different story. A few hours passed, and everything seemed relatively calm. We set up sleeping bags in the living room, and while some of us were nervous, we managed to laugh it off. That was until we heard the footsteps. They started around midnight, heavy, deliberate footsteps from the second floor, moving slowly across the creaky wooden floors. All of us froze, staring at each other in disbelief. No one was upstairs. "Okay, who's messing with us?" Scott, the boldest of the group, called out, but no one was laughing. We decided to investigate, thinking maybe one of us had gone upstairs as a prank. But when we reached the top of the stairs, the air felt wrong, thicker, colder. The hallway stretched out in front of us, lined with old family portraits that seemed to watch our every move. And then, the footsteps started again, this time behind us. I spun around, shining my flashlight down the dark corridor, but there was no one there. My heart pounded in my chest, and I could see the fear in everyone's eyes. We weren't alone. We retreated downstairs, but the activity only intensified. Doors that had been shut were now wide open, and the once still air was filled with an unsettling pressure. Jenny screamed as she swore she saw a shadow dart across the hallway, and Mark's flashlight suddenly flickered and died. "We need to get out of here," I said, my voice trembling. But just as we reached for the front door, it slammed shut with a deafening bang. We pulled and tugged, but it wouldn't budge. Panic set in as we realized we were trapped, and that's when the real terror began. The house came alive. The whispers grew louder, now filling every corner of the room. Shadows danced along the walls, twisting and writhing in unnatural ways. I could feel something, someone, watching us, breathing down our necks. Scott ran to the window, trying to break it open, but the glass wouldn't shatter. No matter how hard he hit it, the house seemed to resist any attempt at escape. Suddenly, the lights flickered, and in the brief flashes of light, we saw them, the figures, pale, ghostly figures, standing at the edge of the room, watching us. They were dressed in old-fashioned clothes, their faces twisted in pain, their eyes hollow and empty. We backed away, but they moved closer. Every time the lights flickered, they were nearer, their forms becoming more distinct, more solid. And then, one of them spoke. "Why are you here?" The voice was cold, hollow, and it echoed through the room, freezing us in place. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The figure reached out, its bony hand inches from my face, and I felt an icy chill shoot through my body. "We have to go," Jenny screamed, snapping me out of my paralysis. We ran, scrambling for any exit we could find, but the house seemed to be alive, shifting and closing in on us. Every door we opened led to another dead end, and the figures were closing in. In a last-ditch effort, Scott kicked down a door leading to the basement. It was a terrible idea, but we had no choice. We rushed down the stairs, the cold, damp air hitting us like a wall. The basement was worse, dark, cold, and filled with old, rotting furniture. And in the far corner, a large ancient mirror stood, its surface cracked and covered in dust. As soon as we entered, the door slammed shut behind us, trapping us inside. The figures appeared again, their reflection visible in the mirror, but this time, they didn't stay still. They moved toward the mirror, reaching out as if trying to pull themselves through. "We have to destroy it," Mark said, grabbing a nearby chair and smashing it into the mirror. The glass shattered, and for a moment, the figures vanished. But the relief was short-lived. The house groaned, and the walls began to close in. With no other options, we huddled together, bracing for whatever was coming. The air grew colder, the shadows darker, and just when I thought it was over, the door to the basement flew open. We didn't question it. We ran. As we burst through the front door and into the night, I looked back at the house. The figures were there, standing in the doorway, watching us as we fled into the darkness. We never spoke about what happened at Blackwood Manor, but every time I close my eyes, I see them, the figures, the whispers, the shadows, and I know deep down that the house is still waiting for someone else to come inside. I had always been drawn to the rich history and vibrant culture of New Orleans, but nothing could have prepared me for what happened when I agreed to stay in the old Creole townhouse in the French Quarter. It was supposed to be a weekend getaway with my two best friends, Claire and Ethan, filled with jazz, food, and exploring the haunted legends of the city. Little did I know, we would become part of that legend ourselves. The house we rented stood at the edge of Bourbon Street, a narrow 3-story townhouse that had been around since the 1800s. Its wrought iron balconies were covered in vines, and its exterior had a worn charm, like a place that had seen too many years. The owner told us it had once been home to a wealthy Creole family, but after a series of unexplained deaths, it had fallen into disrepair. Locals whispered about the house, claiming it was cursed, but we didn't think much of it. After all, New Orleans was known for its ghost stories. The first day was uneventful. We spent the afternoon touring the French Quarter, soaking in the sounds of the city, eating beignets, and enjoying the vibrant energy. By the time we returned to the townhouse, it was late, and the streets had emptied. The house, however, felt different at night. The lively energy outside seemed to vanish as soon as we stepped inside, replaced by an overwhelming stillness. It wasn't until we were all settled in for the night that things began to feel off. Claire and I were sharing the master bedroom on the second floor, while Ethan had taken the guest room next to us. The house was quiet, too quiet. Even with the windows open, I couldn't hear any of the usual sounds from the street below. No laughter, no music, just silence. Around midnight, I woke up to a strange noise. It was faint at first, like a soft scratching sound coming from the wall next to the bed. I sat up listening, but Claire was fast asleep. The scratching grew louder, more insistent, as if something was trying to claw its way through the wall. My heart raced, and I shook Claire awake. "Do you hear that?" I whispered. She groggily sat up, but the noise stopped as soon as she stirred. "What are you talking about?" she mumbled, already drifting back to sleep. I tried to brush it off as my imagination, but deep down, I knew something was wrong. The next morning, I mentioned the noise to Ethan, but he laughed it off. "It's an old house," he said. "It's probably just rats or something." We spent the day visiting the famous St. Louis cemetery and exploring the dark, twisted history of the city. Ethan joked about us turning into ghost hunters, but as the sun began to set, I couldn't shake the unease I felt about the house. That evening, we sat in the living room, sharing a bottle of wine and talking about the day's adventures. As we laughed and swapped stories, the room grew colder, unnaturally so. Claire noticed it first, shivering and wrapping herself in a blanket. "Is it just me, or is it freezing in here?" she asked. Ethan checked the thermostat, but it was set to a comfortable temperature. The chill seemed to seep in from the walls, creeping through the cracks and filling the room with a sense of dread. Suddenly, the lights flickered, and we all froze. The laughter died in our throats as the room plunged into darkness. The lights came back on a moment later, but something had changed. The atmosphere in the house felt heavy, oppressive. I glanced at the wall where I had heard the scratching the night before, and my blood ran cold. Faint, jagged lines were etched into the plaster, like claw marks, and they hadn't been there earlier. "What the hell?" I muttered, pointing to the wall. Claire and Ethan stared in shock, but before we could react, we heard a loud thud from upstairs. It sounded like something heavy had fallen to the floor, but we were the only ones in the house. Ethan grabbed a flashlight, and we cautiously made our way up the narrow staircase. As we reached the second floor, the temperature dropped even further. I could see my breath in the air, and the walls seemed to close in on us. The noise had come from the guest room, Ethan's room. The door was slightly ajar, and I could feel the icy air seeping out. Ethan pushed the door open, and what we saw inside made my stomach turn. His suitcase had been thrown across the room, clothes strewn everywhere. But that wasn't the worst part. In the center of the room, carved into the wooden floor, was a single word: "Leave." We stood frozen in horror, our minds racing. There was no logical explanation for what we were seeing. "We need to get out of here," Claire whispered, her voice trembling. But Ethan, ever the skeptic, shook his head. "It's just some prank," he insisted, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. "Someone's messing with us." That night, none of us could sleep. We stayed together in the living room, every creak and groan of the house setting us on edge. Around 3 a.m., the scratching started again, but this time, it wasn't confined to the walls. It came from all around us, the ceiling, the floors, even the furniture. Suddenly, the chandelier above us began to sway, as if something invisible had brushed against it. And then, without warning, it crashed to the floor, shattering into pieces. We jumped to our feet, but before we could move, the front door slammed shut with a deafening bang. "Get out!" a voice hissed, low and guttural, echoing through the room. It sounded like it was coming from the very walls themselves. We didn't need to be told twice. We grabbed our things and ran for the door, but it wouldn't budge. It was as if the house itself was trapping us, holding us prisoner within its cursed walls. The temperature continued to drop, and I could feel the presence of something malevolent closing in. Shadows danced along the walls, and the air grew thick with the scent of decay. Just when I thought we were done for, the door flew open, and we stumbled out into the cool night air. We didn't stop running until we were several blocks away, the house looming behind us like a dark specter. We never spoke of what happened in that house. We returned to our normal lives, but I could never shake the feeling that something had followed us. I still have nightmares about the townhouse in the French Quarter, and sometimes I wake up to the sound of scratching in the walls. I know one thing for sure: I will never set foot in New Orleans again. Blackwood Manor might have its legends, but nothing compares to the terror of the cursed house on Bourbon Street. It all started as a spontaneous road trip to San Francisco. My friends, Jess, Nate, and I needed a break from the mundane, so we decided to explore the West Coast. We were excited to visit the Golden Gate Bridge, Alcatraz, and the famous hilly streets of the city. But as we were searching for an affordable place to stay, we stumbled upon a listing on a local site. A beautiful old Victorian house in the Nob Hill neighborhood, known for its historic charm. It seemed perfect, almost too perfect. The listing was oddly cheap for the location, but we didn't think much of it. We were young and carefree, just looking for a cool place to crash for a few nights. The pictures showed a pristine, well-kept home with tall windows, intricate woodwork, and a view of the bay. Without hesitation, we booked it. When we arrived, the house was even more impressive in person, but it had an unsettling aura. It was massive, with a grand entrance, a staircase that spiraled upward, and rooms filled with antique furniture. It looked like something out of a Gothic novel, but still, we brushed off the eerie vibe and made ourselves at home. That night, we sat in the spacious living room, sharing a bottle of wine and talking about our plans for the next day. The conversation was light, but there was an unshakable feeling of being watched. It started with small things. Nate noticed a chill in the air, despite the warmth outside. Jess commented on how the house seemed too quiet, even for being in the middle of a bustling city. It was as if the walls were absorbing every sound. Later, I found a dusty old journal in one of the bookshelves. Curious, I opened it. The handwriting was nearly illegible, but one entry stood out. It was dated from the early 1900s and described a series of tragic deaths that had taken place in the house. A family of 5, all found dead in their beds, with no explanation. The neighborhood called it the Silent Hill House because after the deaths, no one dared to speak about what happened there. I told Jess and Nate about the journal, but they just laughed, saying it was probably some creepy story left behind to mess with guests. I laughed with them, but the feeling in my gut told me otherwise. It wasn't until the second night that things took a dark turn. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to the sound of scratching, faint but unmistakable, like nails dragging across wood. At first, I thought it was just an old house settling, but the sound didn't stop. It seemed to move, starting from the floor near my bed and creeping toward the walls. I froze, listening intently, hoping it was just my imagination. But then I heard a soft whisper, a voice so low I couldn't make out the words, but it sounded desperate, pleading. My heart pounded in my chest, and I bolted up, turning on the bedside lamp. There was nothing there, but the scratching continued. The next morning, I told Jess and Nate about what I heard. Nate shrugged it off, claiming old houses creak all the time, but Jess looked pale. She admitted she had heard something too, a voice, but in her dream. It called her name over and over until she woke up in a cold sweat. We agreed to explore the house that day, hoping to find some logical explanation for what we were experiencing. As we moved from room to room, the unsettling feeling grew stronger. In one of the smaller bedrooms, we found something that made my blood run cold. Faint claw marks on the floor, similar to the sound I had heard the night before. They were long, deep scratches, like something had been desperately trying to escape. That night, everything went to hell. Around midnight, we were sitting in the living room, trying to distract ourselves with a movie. But halfway through, the TV flickered, then turned off on its own. The room grew colder, and suddenly, the scratching sound started again, louder this time, coming from the walls, the ceiling, the floors. "Is this some kind of joke?" Nate said, standing up, his voice trembling with a mixture of anger and fear. Before I could respond, the lights began to flicker, casting eerie shadows around the room. Jess clung to my arm, her face pale. The scratching was relentless now, like something was crawling inside the walls, desperate to get out. Then we heard it. Footsteps on the staircase. Slow, deliberate, as if someone was coming down to meet us. We stared at the dark hallway, hearts pounding, waiting for whatever was there to reveal itself. Out of nowhere, the door to the living room slammed shut with a deafening bang, trapping us inside. The lights went out completely, plunging the room into total darkness. Jess screamed, and I could feel her trembling next to me. Nate rushed to the door, pulling at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. And then we heard the voice. It was a woman's voice, echoing through the room like a distant whisper. "Leave. Now." Panic set in. The room felt like it was closing in on us, the air thick with the presence of something evil. I grabbed Jess's hand, and together we ran toward the windows, hoping to escape that way. But as soon as we reached them, they slammed shut on their own, trapping us inside. Nate pounded on the door, screaming for help, but the house absorbed every sound. The footsteps grew louder, as if whoever or whatever was on the stairs was getting closer. In a desperate move, I grabbed a chair and threw it at the window. The glass shattered, and without thinking, we climbed out onto the fire escape. The moment we stepped outside, the air felt different, lighter, as if the oppressive force of the house couldn't reach us there. We ran through the streets of San Francisco, not stopping until we reached a well-lit area near a bar. None of us spoke as we tried to catch our breath, the terror still fresh in our minds. The next day, we left the city. None of us wanted to stay in San Francisco any longer, and we swore we would never speak of what happened in that house. But the nightmares continued, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed us. I tried to research the history of the house, but the records were vague, as if the city itself wanted to forget its dark past. Some people online claimed the house had been demolished years ago, but I knew that couldn't be true. We had been there. We had lived through it. To this day, I can still hear the scratching in the walls when I close my eyes. And sometimes, in the dead of night, I hear a whisper, faint but unmistakable, calling my name. The Silent Hill House of San Francisco is still out there, waiting for its next victims.